Alright, welcome back to another one. In one of my last videos, I talked about this Geode thin client board, and it had a few limitations which made it very difficult for me to do anything with it. So it had limited amount of RAM which was soldered, so couldn't change it. Just 128 megabytes, and it had virtually limited amount of storage. So this is a storage module. This is a IDE DOM, but it's on a proprietary connector which we can't find anymore. So this is just 16 megabytes. So at best, this runs FreeDOS and a very limited install of that too. So although it was a great hardware, it was one of the 800 megahertz Geode GX. It was fairly limited. The BIOS was very limited as well. The USB boot not always worked. Um, so I have a new one. This is an AMD Geode. So it's one of the proper AMD Geodes instead of a NEC one, but it's still based on the Geode GX design. It just on LS CPU it says it's AMD. Um, this one runs at 500 megahertz. I'll take the heatsink off in a minute, but it has a few things that are much better. First of all, the BIOS is much better on this one. It boots a lot more things through a lot more medium. It has a single slot of upgradable RAM, so it came with 128 megabytes of DDR1 memory, and I have now upgraded to 256. At one point, I did have 512 on it, and it worked fine. That's the max amount of memory you can go for. There is an IDE port. There's just no way to power an IDE device, so unless you have an external power supply, this doesn't work. But this is an IDE port that's available. It's not very well documented, but I've pinned out the ground points and it matches, and it really seems to be an IDE port. In terms of connections, it has a couple of USB ports at the back, PS2 for keyboard and mouse, VGA serial, one USB port up front, gigabit LAN, and audio jack. I'm all pretty sure it is gigabit. That's what it shows up as, and it works. And 12 volts power input. It has your RTC battery right there, and apart from that, not much. At the back, this has a a CF card slot. So basically IDE. The and so this is upgradable. I have a full FreeDOS installation here. I have Debian, Windows 98, Windows 2000, just to show that things actually work and they boot and they run fine. There is a second unpopulated SODIMM slot, so I'm not really sure if this is like a dual DIMM per channel situation or a single DIMM for two channel situation, or is it just an alternative placement for the single DIMM for one channel that we have right here. So it could be both. Just if I don't know, I need to like buy a DIMM and then populate it, and then the heatsink point a heatsink like anchor gets in the way. That's weird as well. So not sure what the DIMM situation there is, and even if this DIMM is supported by the BIOS, that's another thing. So the only downside is this sock is 500 megahertz instead of 800 megahertz, and with the low power design of these socks, so this entire board, including the RAM, including the TF card, including the networking stuff, everything else consumes only 5 watts. So it's a really low power board, and I'm not entirely sure why they would use thermal goop, which was in here before, and I had to manually remove it. I replaced it with thermal pads, and they seem to work fine, although some dust gets in the way. Sadly, the thermal goop that was on here before I had added my thermal pad removed a lot of the marking, a lot of the, so these are embossed, and then there's a little bit of paint added on top of them, but only the embossed part is remaining, and it's void of any paint, so you can barely see the AMD Geode logo there. And apart from that, I'll add a better image of the sock, but this is as good as it gets, especially after whatever remaining was got sort of sucked up by the thermal pad as well. So as I was saying, this is just a 5 watt for the entire board, and it really doesn't produce as much heat to like justify thermal goop. My thermal pads are doing fine. And the other problem with it being just a 5 watt board is that it doesn't really perform. In that space, you really feel the difference between an 800 megahertz CPU and a 500 megahertz one, and there's no in-BIOS option to actually overclock it. So as far as we know, this is a Fujitsu Siemens thin client board. I'm not sure if it's one of the actual Fujitsu thin client board, or if Fujitsu was just manufacturing the PCB. But that's what it seems to be. It has another hardware quirk that I wanted to address before I got into the operating systems and how they perform. The USB ports are very low power, so they, I think, do maybe even less than 300 mA, like 250 mA. So they don't reach 500 mA spec of the 500 mA USB 2 spec. So to boot from CD-ROM, and for some operating systems, it's actually better to boot from CD-ROM even over USB than to boot from USB stick. So I have to have a weird fixture, a weird cable like this. So this is a Y cable, a Y USB OTG cable, and I don't know if the folks have ever seen something like this before. This is a micro USB to type A, micro USB female to type A male, and this is what would usually go to your phone's OTG port, but instead we are just using as a USB A male port, and this is for power. So you plug one of these in each of the sockets, and that gives enough current to run an external CD-ROM drive, which is not the case if you just plug in the external CD-ROM drive directly. It tries to boot, and when it spins up at a higher RPM, it fails. Right, so apart from that, you have a Winborn chip right here. That's your Super IO, so that's probably doing serial and PS2, maybe a couple other things, some GPIO related stuff that might be there, maybe one of the USBs through that. And then that's your Realtek chip for audio, and then at the back you have another Realtek chip, that's the gigabit LAN chip. So yeah, that's your massive amount of 256 megabytes of memory, which is enough to boot Debian into console only mode. Apart from that, they have neat little things. This buzzer is very loud, so that's usable. The hard drive LED has an external port here, the power LED has an external port here, so you can actually hook it up to like inside a case and then use it externally. It seems to be a USB port. I'm not sure because it has plus 5 volts at the correct point, and this for sure seems to be a way to flash the onboard boot ROM, EEPROM. So let's go ahead, power this thing up and show you how everything looks. Alright, so I have my capture card plugged in, I have my power plugged in. Let's go ahead and turn it on. And you can hear the beep, and it should show up with the Siemens Fujitsu logo right there. So it will try to boot, and I'm not sure why it does that. That's, I think, on the capture card end. So let me re-plug that. I hope this only happens once. Alright, so here's an issue with FreeDOS. Anything to do with JEMM, it does not work. It needs to boot in safe mode with load drivers, in just safe mode or emergency mode without drivers. So I'll just boot it in safe mode, and hopefully that works fine. So here we are, and yeah, the capture card is acting very weird, not sure why, but this is the only good one I have. Alright, so We are in DOS. There's only one thing to do. Let's play Doom port. So games, boom, and boom. And there we go. So it works fine. I think the colors are slightly off on the capture card, slightly darkened. Otherwise, the display is fine. And yeah, it works well. It's drawing around 5.9 watts just with this. So it's certainly working hard even to run it at the frame rate it's running it at. And yeah, I'm not complaining for such a low power board. It's barely warm to the touch. So that is FreeDOS. It works fine. There may be few graphical things you might not be able to run. I know of some desktop like environments that FreeDOS now ships with, which won't run on this. But for the most part, DOS runs fine. I haven't had much issues now that I've played with it a lot, but at least Doom works a couple other games about. So that's Doom on FreeDOS. So that is working just fine. Alright, so let's move out of Doom and set up Linux and see how that goes. Alright, so I've changed my capture card. Let's see if this works. I have Debian. Alright, booting Debian, and you can hear the beep. Let's wait for the logo. There you go. And from here we can boot Debian. It is quite slow, so this is going to take a while. I'll play it back in real time just to show how slow it really is, because yeah, 500 megahertz is quite painful. And it's still booting, like there's no issues, like it's still drawing 6.2 watts. Curious why it's not displaying anything. There you go. So even in this capture card I had to reconnect the VGA port, so this is getting a bit weird. So it might be that the VGA output on this thing has very limited modes. But as you can see, we are still at system reboot, but we've reached login, and this was all in real time. I haven't cut it anywhere. So if I do root, here we are. Now LSCPU has an interesting output. You can see all of these vulnerabilities and mitigations there. Spectre v1, Spectre v2, and I'm not sure if Meltdown is listed, but it's not. It might actually not be vulnerable from a CPU design standpoint, but Linux just assumes vulnerable, and it does it based on some of the CPU flags. So in the last line, you can see a bunch of CPU flags. I'll clear the door. Right. So you can see the remaining CPU flags and the vulnerabilities. It's not really vulnerable. It decides whether a CPU might have, Linux decides whether a CPU might have certain vulnerabilities based on the CPU flag, and then if it does not report that it's been fixed, it assumes that it's vulnerable and applies the correct workarounds and mitigations. So that's what this is about. It's not really an issue. Alright, so I guess that was about it for Debian, and let's move on to Windows 98 and then followed by Windows 2000. So I'm just going to shut this down. To Windows 95, and let's move this again. Yeah, this VGA thing is really a pain. Oh, there you go. So you guys missed the Windows loading screen, Windows 98 loading screen, but at least you have the entire window booted out without me having to disturb anything. So yeah, the VGA capture situation is a bit bad, but hopefully it works. So not much here. Everything works. I haven't added many apps or anything to it. The default ones are what there are. Let's see if there's something interesting, but apart from that, things work as they do. Here's your Paint. I've actually not opened Paint in a long time, although I play with Windows 95, 98 all the time. But yeah, Paint is something I haven't opened up. But yeah, it works fine. It's a bit slow, but still, as far as Windows 98 is concerned, it's still good. And if you go to properties, you can see authentic AMD Geode. So instead of NEC, and do 40 megabytes of RAM, device would show other things. PS2 mouse, hit compliant mouse, at the USB mouse I'm using, PCI card for Ethernet, multimedia audio, universal serial bus on USB, and a couple other things. So it doesn't have drivers for the AMD Geode graphics. Well, there is such a thing apparently, but it just doesn't have the drivers for it, so it's not extremely quick. Apart from that, yeah, it's basic Windows 98 SE working just fine. So let's move to Windows 2000. Not much you should see here. Alright, powering on for Windows 2000, so an NT based OS that's not dead slow on this hardware, unlike Windows XP. Let's give it a minute to boot up. And again, I think you are missing the initial boot screen. But there you go. At least Windows 2000 boot screen works. And then it goes away. Yeah, VGA is weird. And there you go. So that's Windows 2000 working just fine. Again, 16-bit killer mode, no graphics driver so far. And Geode by AMD PCS. And that's the amount of RAM you have. I don't think this has drivers as well for most of the things. Yep, everything is pretty much missing. I know it says batteries. This is Microsoft AC adapter. Okay, apparently it detects it's a embedded system of all sorts. Yeah, this doesn't show the NT version, but this is Windows 2000 Service Pack 4. and it has games on it. It has pinball that we can try. I don't think this has DOS emulator of any sort though. Let's try pinball in glorious 16-bit color. There you go. Let's try. Yeah, it works fine, just looks absolutely terrible. And without sound, it's not much fun. So this was about it for the AMD Geode. The AMD branded AMD Geode. So although it's still using the old NEC design, but hopefully I'll have more interesting hardware in the future. I just wanted to have a Geode kit that was usable, unlike the other one that I have, and this is more than usable for me. I can load operating systems, Linux works just fine. There's some issue with FreeBSD and the VGA again, so not sure why that's being problematic, but I have booted NetBSD on it, OpenBSD on it, and everything else works fine. So this is a nice kit, although it's slightly slower than the other one, and it's not a socketed CPU, so I can't just jump CPUs across. Thank you so much for watching. This has been amazing to make and play with. Do subscribe because I have a couple of very interesting thin clients in my backlog of videos I have to make for. So hopefully I can get through them as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.